We're happy to have Stella Offner here, who is a professor of astronomy at UT, and this will definitely be our first machine learning plus astronomy talk. So I'm particularly excited to hear about it. Stella got her PhD from UC Berkeley in physics, and she was an NSF Astronomy and Astrophysics Prize postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, which sounds like the coolest place you could possibly do a postdoc. And she was also a NASA Hubble postdoctoral fellow at Yale. She's the recipient of many awards, including an NSF Career Award. And her research focuses on star formation. So I'm super excited to see how machine learning techniques will play into that. So thanks for being here, Stella, and please, take it away.
All right, thanks everyone for joining me today. And I've tried to, do a good level of background for people who are less familiar with astronomy concepts. But feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I'm happy to answer them or start a discussion. All right, so my talk is really three parts. First, why this particular problem? Why turn our attention to stars? What are the open questions? Two, why do we need machine learning to answer these questions? And then three, what can we actually learn by applying these kinds of techniques on the data? So it turns out there's a lot we don't understand about our own sun, despite it being very close and relatively easy to observe. So we don't understand things like, why is our sun the mass it is? What sets the mass distribution of stars? Why is there only one star in the solar system? I'm sure many of you have never thought about that before. Some star systems actually have 2 or 3 stars. So how did we end up with only one? And then why do the planets have the properties they do? It turns out that question is also related to the formation of the star and the whole solar system. And so there's a lot of really big picture, basic questions that we're still trying to understand. And so I would argue that the answers lie in the birthplaces of stars, so-called molecular clouds. And so that's where we're going to be turning our attention today. So if we want to understand the formation of stars, in our sun in particular, it turns out that the conditions where our sun formed have dispersed long, long ago. So if we want to understand our own sun, we have to look outwards and look at star formation that's happening in the galaxy right now. This is not our galaxy, but it's a beautiful nearby galaxy. And this galaxy is in the process, like the Milky Way, of forming a variety of stars. And this is the biggest picture scale that we have in this problem, right? So something about the gas in the galaxies collects and then ultimately forms stellar birthplaces, which we call molecular clouds. So these are made mostly of molecular gas. They look kind of cloud-like, but it turns out that their properties are orders of magnitude different than what you might be thinking about clouds in our sky. Below that, one of those clouds might be forming thousands of stars, but a system like our own would have formed out of something called a dense core, which is dense by astronomer terms. It is still maybe comparable to the most highest level vacuum that we can get in the laboratory on Earth. For astronomers, that's dense. And so zooming in further, a system of planets like ours would have formed in an accretion disk on scales of maybe 100 times our Earth-Sun distance. And so there's, as you can see, a huge range of scales involved in taking information and mass, starting from the galaxy scale all the way down to the star scale. Now, this is all going from top down, but there are also bottom up processes. So one of which is that stars, while they're forming, will eject at very high velocities, hundreds of kilometers per second. They will eject mass into their surroundings, putting in energy, momentum, and shaping them. If you have a slightly more massive star, you can affect the surroundings via winds or radiation. We, of course, also have a stellar wind, but it's relatively weak compared to massive stars that might be tens of times the mass of our sun. And so these kind of stars blow out these bubbles around them. And then finally, ultimately, the most massive stars will die and return all of the material around them back into the galactic, interstellar medium in a supernova explosion. So this really broad range of scales from top down to bottom up really outlines a cycle of life, right? So we have a lot of very complex physics happening here that's connecting a really broad range of physical scales. So why do we need machine learning for this problem? So the first reason is that this is a really messy process. We have really messy data. So the previous slides give you some idea of just how messy, complex, and interconnected the data is that astronomers are looking at. So just to give you some more idea, this is a pan of our galaxy, looking at the galactic plane. We're actually looking using the Spitzer Space Telescope. It makes a map of the dust emission in the infrared. And you can see all this beautiful structure. And you can see there's a variety of different features here. You can see these red and yellow things here that look sort of bubble-like. These are the features that are probably created by massive stars or star clusters, sweeping up and pushing out the gas around them. You can also see some darker features here. These are colder regions, which are more similar to molecular clouds. So maybe they have much younger stars. They don't have massive stars in them. But you can still see them here just as because they're not emitting in the infrared. So that particular example was only even a small part of our map of the galaxy, right? So there's just a ton of very messy data, right? So there's a lot of it. So astronomers have dealt with this in the past by harnessing citizen scientists, right? So literally putting the data online and letting non-astronomers log in and help us classify the data. So maybe as computer scientists, that strikes you with horror that this is nothing analytic or very rigorous about this. We're literally asking people to help us classify objects. So here's an example. So if you log on, create a profile in this Milky Way science project, it looks at the data that we just saw. And so you might be confronted with an image like this one. It would say, what is this? What's in the image? It would say, oh, well, it's a bubble, probably created by a massive star. And it's about this big. All right. So, and then you would literally kind of draw a circle around it. And so that's nice. But then you might also be confronted with an image like this one. So maybe that's a bubble, or I don't know. It's sort of hard to tell. So human classifications have been used for a very large number of astronomy data projects. The most famous one of which is the Galaxy Zoo, in which people log in and classify the types of galaxies in different surveys. And this is literally hundreds of thousands of citizen science hours go into doing this. So, but there are some pros and cons, right? So pros, we engage the public in science, get them involved, which is great because most of our funding comes from science. So if we can get them involved, then in that whole effort, then we can also motivate why what we're doing is important. And the public is numerous. There are way more members of the public than there are astronomers. So this is great. And they work for free. And this is wonderful. So it's even better than grad students, right? You don't have to, pay them. They just do it as a hobby. It's wonderful. And sometimes you might not believe this, but members of the public are quite smart, right? They can classify atypical cases. If they see something weird in the data, they will tell you about it. In fact, all of these citizen science projects have a forum in which people can, when they log on, say, oh, I found this thing in this image. I don't know what it is. It looks weird. You astronomers should check it out, right? And so we found a number of interesting things that way, including things called quasar light echoes, which were found from these sort of weird things that cropped up in the data. And some member of the public was looking at the data and found these things. Now,
what are those things?
Yeah, so the quasar light echoes is what appeared in the data is this kind of fuzzy blob that looks sort of greenish, if I remember correctly. But it's actually, you can see the propagation of the light, which creates this weird thing in the data. And then people, now that they know about them, they can actually measure that and learn something about quasars and their properties. So quasars are, black holes that are emitting, because they're accreting or something. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I thought black holes didn't emit. I don't know anything. I thought black holes didn't emit light.
Yeah. So these, so if you have a black hole that's not accreting, then yeah, you don't see it. But if you have an object where it's accreting material, what you're seeing is not the stuff that's actually falling onto the black hole.
Oh, okay, okay, I understand.
You see the stuff that's the warm material around it.
Right.
All right. But there are also, negative aspects to using people, right? There's different opinions. So two different people can tell you two different things about the data. You need to be able to describe the problem in terms of simple instructions. So if you want a uniform, response from people, then you need to be able to make sure everyone is interpreting the task the same way. And then people can be hangry, right? So depending upon whether they actually ate breakfast or not, they might decide to be more optimistic or pessimistic about what's actually in the image, okay? And then last but not least, even if you have the best classifiers, expert astronomers, you don't actually know the right answer. You do not have the ground truth. So this makes it a very complex data problem, whether you're trying to do this problem using citizen scientists or whether astronomers are just looking at the data and trying to tell you. So number 3 is that, yes, the data is messy, but it's also 3-dimensional. So the images we saw before were fairly 2-dimensional. You're looking at radiation in actually 3 different bands of wavelengths, but it's basically a 2D image. Now, if we look at a range of different frequencies, then what we have is not a 2D image, but a 3D data cube. So here's an example of that. This is looking at one of these very cold clouds, molecular clouds where stars are forming. And because it's so cold, we look at it in the radio. And what we're using here is essentially the Doppler effect. So as the gas is moving along the line of sight, it becomes red or blue shifted. And so that change in velocity gives you a change in wavelength, which adds up to a 3rd dimension in the data. So you can think of it as position, X and Y, and then the 3rd dimension is velocity or wavelength. So looking at this data, if you're trying to pick up a bubble just by eye, you can see there's one maybe here. Maybe there's another one here. We are seeing a part of it. But this data is less clean and it's much harder to reduce to a simple task. In terms of you're trying to put it in front of the public, it's not totally clear what instructions you would be giving them. So this particular data set was ultimately classified by an expert human who did their PhD in visualization and applied physics program. And so part of her thesis was literally looking at the data and identifying these features visually, right? So we need to do something better. And this is where the machine learning comes in. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the algorithm that we're using and then what we can actually learn by applying this to the data. We're going to focus on finding 2 features, stellar winds created by these massive stars, so bubbles, and these stellar outflows where the gas is being ejected at high velocities. And by identifying these in an automatic way, hopefully we can overcome some of the problems that we have when humans or astronomers are just visually looking at the data and trying to find things. So here is a nearby molecular cloud. And what we're seeing here is dust emission. Marked on top of it are these circles. These are shells that were picked out from an expert astronomer visually looking at the data, actually in a three-dimensional way, though that's not apparent here because it's showing you a 2D map. But what they found is by identifying these rings, these bubbles, and adding up the mass, momentum, and energy, it's a huge fraction of the total kinetic energy of the whole cloud. So that suggests that as these stars are forming and they have this feedback where they're affecting the surrounding cloud, they are really dynamically influencing their environment. So that can affect the lifetime of how long stars are forming, definitely affects the kinematics of the gas motions, and maybe it triggers or suppresses additional formation of stars. So trying to understand how these stars interact with our birth environment tells us a lot about the larger picture, and even things like the stellar masses and how fast stars form. So this is the idea. Maybe these winds inject a lot of energy. But it comes down to counting, right? In order to count the energetics, we need to be able to find them and do it correctly, which really can't be done by classical approaches, right? There is no analytic model because the data is so complex that we can simply apply and classically find these features, which is why you have the situation where astronomers are just looking at the data and trying to find things visually. So the idea that I had was, okay, what we need is training data. We need a set of data where we know exactly what the right answer is. And it turns out that hydrodynamic simulations are exactly what we need. So these are, it can be a virtual laboratory because we can put in these different types of feedback and follow the evolution. And because this is happening on our computers, we can actually track where the feedback is very quantitatively and exactly. So we can train an algorithm to identify features, even if we don't have a back of the envelope analytic model. So this is a volume rendering, kind of like my background, but this is showing you velocity. So the highest velocities are where the winds are expanding outwards from the star. You can't see the stars, just the winds here. So that's in red, and then intermediate velocities are in blue, and the birth environment kind of background cloud is in gray. So again, you can see that this is very complicated sort of interaction between these forming stars, the winds, and the surrounding environment. All right, so in constructing the training set, we want to train it to do two things. First, we want it to work in theory land, right? In theory land, we know actual gas densities. We know the three-dimensional information. So in task one, we want to train our algorithm to identify the feedback just using three-dimensional density in X, Y, and Z. In task two, we want to identify these features, but now we want to identify it in emission. So there we have X, Y, and velocity, which is a different type of data. So the key here that allows us to do that is something called the tracer field, which is tracing where these bubbles are. So it's basically a pixel or voxel level map of where the feedback is, and it's our key to training the network to find what we want. So for example, an input here in CO emission is shown on these images on the left. In the middle is a sort of binary map of where exactly those bubbles are. And if you are comparing left and the right, you know, just by looking at the left, it's not so easy to say where the bubble is, right? So it's not together obvious. So the trick also of being successful is to build up a training set that's as broad as possible. So we want different evolutionary times, different cloud properties like magnetic field strengths, different star properties. We want to adjust for resolution and noise, and just make it as large as possible. So here's what our network looks like. We're using a UNet approach with cross connections. So this is sort of like an autoencoder in the sense that there's an encoder part here and a decoder part here. we find in experimenting with different architectures that these cross connections were actually very important for being able to reconstruct and identify both coarse and fine features. So this particular network has 4 layers, and the inputs are 256 squared images times some batch size. I think we initially ran this with 8. And then we do the normal, training where we iterate to convergence, and we get pretty good results to, better than 5% as dictated by a mean squared error loss function. And then we, have our training set also where we validate and test it on data where we haven't actually seen, where the network hasn't seen that data before. So we can assess how well the performance is doing.
Sorry, can I ask a question here?
Yes.
Are you using this as an autoencoder? Are you autoencoding the images?
So my understanding is it's sort of like an autoencoder. It's not strictly speaking exactly an autoencoder, but it does have a similar framework. So it's an autoencoder in the sense that we want it to at least learn part of the image, where the thing that we want it to learn is the features associated with the bubble. But we don't need it to learn and exactly reproduce the entire image. So it's like an autoencoder, but not exactly.
I see. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, so here is the input, the target, and then the prediction for one of our test sets. All right, so just for comparison, I'm showing you the voxels it predicts as being associated with the feedback, and visually you can see it's doing a pretty good job. So another way of looking at this is by looking at true positives, false positives, and false negatives. So the true positive, where it's identified exactly the correct answers in blue. The false positive, where it's sort of over predicted and put in extra pixels, is in purple. You can see this is around the boundaries, where it's not, you can imagine why it's getting that wrong. It's pretty hard to tell the difference between the true feedback and the boundary. And then there's some cases where there's a false negative where it should have found something it didn't. And it's doing a pretty good job. Here's one where it's doing less well and missing some of the feedback. But I think what you can see by eye is that it's actually pretty hard to identify where the feedback is. If you were just looking at these images without seeing the colors on top, you would probably not be able to identify where the bubbles were that it was looking for. All right, so for full disclosure, okay, so we created this 2D CNN. We train it on our simulations. Now it's time to apply it to real data. All right, so we take our Perseus, a piece of this Perseus star forming region I showed you before. All right, here's the data. This is looking at a sort of data slice. There's the bubble it's supposed to be identifying. And here's what our network found. All right, so I would call this a total fail. And so this was not what we wanted. So what happened? Well, we spent a fairly long time trying to figure this out. We experimented with different architectures, different hyperparameters, et cetera. And ultimately, what we found is really the problem is not the machine learning. The problem is really the data, because we're missing something fundamental. I mentioned before that the data is 3-dimensional. If we only feed the network 2-dimensional images, if we use a 2D CNN, then it doesn't learn the connection in the 3rd dimension. It doesn't learn the relationship between velocity, which turns out to be important because these bubbles are not just round, but they're also physically expanding. So there's a 3rd dimension that is crucial. It's not just morphology that we need to identify. It is also a velocity feature. So we needed to learn the fully 3-dimensional structure, not just the 2 dimensions. So we reconfigure our network to do, instead of a 2D filters, to do 3D filters. And then we train on simulations, and we're going to try again, applying it to real cloud data. So here's our revised network. It looks pretty similar with the encoder and decoder, the same framework used, except we're basically switching to 3-dimensional filters. In this case, one of the challenges was that in order to identify things successfully, we need a huge training set. For two-dimensional images, that's not really a problem. We can build a huge training set with that. But for 3 dimensions, we need a huge amount of data cubes. This particular one we're training with almost 8,000 data cubes. But 8,000 is still not a huge number if you're working with, if you're accustomed to doing these kinds of training. You might work with hundreds of thousands of images. But one of our limitations that we ran into is that we have to fit our training set on the GPU memory. So we're really limited by, in this case, Maverick 2, and the amount of memory storage we have that we can use. But, so we'll go with this. This is the number of data cubes for our training set. And now we can try again on the real data. All right, so we go through this process, we evaluate the hyperparameters, and we also need to assess how well they do on the real data, because looking at just the test set, you can't necessarily see any real difference in these different hyperparameters. And some of the hyperparameters are about the filters, others are about, what's included in the training set. And so if we just look at the training data, that's not good enough to determine what are the best set of parameters for the real data. So we had to use something we call the mean opinion score to test performance on the observed data. And this is basically just saying we're going to assess how well each model is doing by taking a poll amongst what it turns out to be the co-authors as a blind test of how well it's doing. So we're going to compare all these different models for these different hyperparameters, and then we rate them when applied to real data, whether it's doing excellent, good, average, fair, or poor. All right, so it turns out that the network is not that sensitive. The results are not that sensitive to most of the parameters that we tested, and they're performing reasonably well, which is good because we don't want it to be too sensitive to different parameters. There were 2 that were less good. We ended up choosing this one. So Adam, it looked like you had a question.
I was just going to say, how large is the test set? It can't be that large if you have actual opinions on it.
Yeah, so here the test set is the real data, all right? So what's shown in the background is the simulated test set. And then we run these different models on, we have examples where it was visually identified by humans. We have these examples that were pre-identified by people as being bubbles. So the things we actually—
Right. Roughly how many, what's the size of that set? Like how many?
Say 30.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not large. Yeah. Otherwise it would defeat the point, right? If we had to look through thousands of images. So the actual test set on the data is what we also subdivided into, the most confident ones, which are pretty visually apparent, and ones that are maybe less confident from the human perspective.
How consistent are humans in their labels?
In this case, there's definitely some variation. So that's what you see on these error bars. That is, the error bars are representing the standard deviation among the co-authors. So there is some spread there, but it's not terrible. I think if we looked at it, as a function of person, we might have a more optimistic and less optimistic co-author amongst the set, but it's not such a huge spread compared to the scale. Okay, so all right, so now we've picked our hyperparameters. We're fairly convinced it can identify things in the data. Now we're going to apply it blindly to all of the observational data and see what we get. So here is one such previously identified shell created. This is the arc-like bubble structure, and the blue is the emission, the CO emission. And the red, which looks very purple, is what our algorithm identified. And you can see it's doing a pretty good job of going around the boundary and picking out the features kind of on the edge. It doesn't identify things in the middle. And it's really identifying at a fairly good, at least visually, is doing a fairly good job at detecting the actual feature in the data. And of course, the upside, training might take a couple days, but once you've trained the network, you can apply it to the data and you can get a good result in a matter of minutes. If you were a human astronomer, first, you would not have any confidence to be able to select this on a pixel by pixel basis. And it would take you quite a long time, maybe to convince yourself that this is actually a feature and this is kind of the size of the feature. All right, so now I want to tell you the tale of two models. All right, so there are a couple of ways we can train our network. There are a couple of outputs that we might want to obtain from the networks. The first thing we might want to obtain is just something that identifies the morphology, the three-dimensional morphology of the feature. And in that way, we want to identify whether or not a given voxel belongs to one of these features, but we don't try to distinguish between material that could be part of the background cloud versus the feedback. We say if it has any morphological connection, we're going to count it as and tag it as part of the feature. And this is similar to how humans would work to identify things in the data. You look for the morphology, but once you find that morphology, you're going to include all of that shape. The alternative is something we'll call model MF, which instead of identifying the emission, where it's identifying the whole voxel, we want it to return the fraction of the mass, not the emission, the fraction of mass actually associated with the feedback. So the algorithm looks at each voxel and then tells us how much mass is actually contributing to the emission that we're seeing there. So we're doing this in part because astronomy and this data has horrible line of sight effects. And this is because when you have that third dimension in velocity, any gas along the line of sight that has a given velocity will be mapped into that voxel. And so you can have things that are not physically associated at all along the line of sight, but if they have the same velocity, they end up in the same velocity bin. And one of the headaches of astronomers has been trying to disentangle these line of sight effects to try to get some discrimination between what is physically related and what is completely different, but just happens to have the same velocity. So in the second model, we're going to train it to identify the mass directly and try and distinguish related mass that's related to feedback and mass that's just accidentally, because it has the same velocity, getting mapped into the same part of the velocity space. So to test these, we're going to compare our CNN to the masses and momentum that were previously identified in a completely different way, but using the same features by people, in particular by Duo, who's on the call. So, all right. So our two models, the top one in blue, that's our emission model, which is performing in a way that's set up explicitly to be the same way that humans identify something visually. And you see there's really good correspondence, 1-to-1. There's fairly low scatter, maybe it's a factor 2, but even though we have very different approaches, we're still able to recover something that's very similar to what people have previously identified before, albeit in a slightly cruder way. The red is our model 2, where we're trying to extract the mass directly from the emission. It's a factor of 10 lower. So this is both encouraging and frustrating. It's encouraging because one of our models agrees great with what people have previously estimated, but our other model is suggesting that maybe that previous identification is overestimating these features and their impact by a factor of 10. So which to believe? We can go back to the training set from the simulations and compare the predicted mass against the true mass, where again, we know the right answer because we have this pixel level accuracy of knowing where the feedback is. Here's the one-to-one line. These open circles are this emission model, and the mass fraction model is down here. So what we learn from this is that the line of sight emission that's not actually associated at all with the feedback with these bubbles, is actually causing these previous estimates to be wrong by a factor of 10. So it's not uncommon for there to be uncertainties in astronomy by orders of magnitude. So it's perhaps not so unsurprising that people looked at this before and then are probably ultimately wrong by a factor of 10.
Sorry, how did you figure out they were off by a factor of 10?
Because we know the right answer. So this is the trick, right? So we have our test set and we know the right answer from the test set. So we can run our model on these.
Oh, I see. I see. You're just evaluating like the line of sight of what they were doing. I see. Sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the problems, right, is that for the observational data, there really is no ground truth. So we're doing the best that we can, and each step we go back to our test set and our simulations to try and evaluate how well or how poorly these different models are doing. All right, so the next task that we're going to have it to do is look not at bubbles, but these long elongated outflows. This data is actually somewhat worse. These are outflows identified by people. You can see they look nothing like the thing in the top left corner. That's a beautiful example of a nice isolated source in actually infrared emission. But the stuff that's in these three-dimensional, these clouds and the radio wavelengths is just a total mess. Even professional astronomers looking at this data, like me and my group members, would say, this barely looks like an outflow at all. How are they even identifying this? So we're going to see if we can use our simulations to train our network again to identify these kinds of new features. So same exact architecture, but we're going to change up the training set and try and get it to identify these very different features. So again, visually, it does pretty well on the test set. When we apply it to the real observational data, it does actually pretty well. So these contours that are white are showing you the identification here. You can see that there's some white contours here, and that's actually where there's young sources. These little Y's and O's are young sources, which are probably creating these outflows. And so it's actually doing a pretty excellent job picking this out and picking that out as well. So this data that I showed you some slides ago actually has protostellar outflows in it. And so we turn our attention to this data and ask it to identify these outflows here, and it actually does a pretty good job. These red boxes are previously identified visual outflows, and actually the yellow ones are new outflows, which were not previously identified by people. This situation down here, that's a rather large star cluster, and it's a total mess. There's kind of outflows everywhere. And one of the advantages of this approach is that we don't require it to identify only one outflow. We say, find all the outflow material. The outflow doesn't have to be isolated. We can give it an arbitrarily messy training set where we have all kinds of interacting young stars and try and get it to identify these features in places where people would just be not able to do anything, just do terribly. So what we found for this cloud is we were able to visually confirm 60 visually identified outflows plus 20 new ones, which we have, I think, very strong confidence in, given that you can also, confirm it by eye and, look at all the features and see, all right, yeah, this is something that looks very similar. There's a young star there and previous people just missed it looking at it visually. And of course, it does this thing where it identifies very complex emission in very messy regions. So here is a sense of what this data looks like in the third dimension. So this is velocity on the y-axis and position on the x-axis. And the outflows with these high velocities, this gives you this shape. And the benefit of this algorithm is it's able to identify the higher velocity material and remove the kind of ambient background low velocity stuff, which is something that humans would have a difficult time doing without this kind of training. And so here's this very messy region. You see the outflow sticking out. It identifies some of the material within the cloud, but it's not selecting everything. So we argue that this allows a much better determination of the physics that we want, mass, momentum, and energy. And what we find is that individual outflows are actually not so different in this case, in part because there's a human cancellation of errors. So humans were, I think, over-identifying cloud material, but under-identifying high-velocity material, which ends up canceling. But our algorithm also identifies 30% more sources than were previously identified. So it's probably increasing the total impact by about 30%. So what we're doing right now is we're applying our trained algorithm on a variety of star-forming regions. The Orion region, which is being shown here on the right, if you could see the sky in the infrared and you know the Orion constellation, Orion star-forming region is right where the Orion's belt is in the Orion constellation. So if you could see the sky in the infrared, you would see this beautiful emission there. It's actually quite large too. Plus these other two regions, Taurus is actually also associated with a well-known constellation, Taurus. Again, you can't see it unless you could see the sky in the infrared. So we're working on including and extending our training to more massive regions. And one of the issues that we are struggling with is how to modify the architecture to improve the dynamic range. From the emission, there's a very large scale between the peak emission and the signal to noise. And so trying to get our algorithm to identify that efficiently has been somewhat challenging. And so we're hoping to make some improvements there. So last but not least, it turns out this approach, this UNet with cross connections is very generic and you can apply it to a variety of problems. My student duo went to one of these TAC computing meetings and started talking to a graduate student in petroleum and geosystems engineering and discovered that our network can actually be used when trained correctly to identify fluid flow in porous materials, basically what's happening underground. So it can be used very generally. I'm not an expert in this field, but apparently it can be very efficient for making predictions for the fluid flow amongst sort of granular rocks, carbonates, and whatever consolidated media are. And in the abstract for this paper, which makes me think I need to work on writing my abstracts better, they note that this shows the successful application of a disruptive technology, physics-based training and machine learning models to the digital rock physics community. So it's really nice that we were able to have that collaboration and apply it to a completely different physical system. So in conclusion, this 3D network has worked really well in astronomy data for spectral cubes from this emission and allows us to correct for observational biases like these radiative transfer effects, the relation between emission and mass, and things like line of sight projection, which is a constant thorn in astronomers' sides. This suggests that the previous human estimates are overestimated by a factor of 10 for these bubbles, and maybe underestimated by 30% for these outflows. What we see when we turn our attention to these regions is that this feedback is everywhere within the molecular clouds, and we're able to count it much more efficiently and accurately using these CNN approaches. And the takeaway message is the impact of these on the star forming region is quite significant. So we have made our algorithms, our architecture public so people can download it and try it out. modify it, build their own training set for a completely different physical problem. So yeah, so if you're interested, take a look. And if you have interesting questions or ideas for how to analyze some of the astronomy data you've seen, I'm happy to hear them. All right, thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Stella. Any questions for Stella?
Yeah, if I may start with a question. So I'm trying to understand this as a general. I didn't understand how you applied it to this other problem, or I don't know what the other problem is. But as a more general question, when you're using this as a framework, what is this like? You need what do you need? You need a supervised problem with like images and identification of a specific object, like a bounding box. Like what? How do you interface? How do I interface with your system if I just have some other data set? Let's say, what do I need?
Yeah, so you need your training set, and you need a pixel level determination of the thing that you want to identify.
Like a bounding box or a label for each pixel, let's say.
A label. You need a label for each pixel.
I see. So I can let's say take photographs of steel, and then maybe there are steel defects, and somebody has to label the defect, and then you would need in the order of 1,000 images or something, and you would be able to identify defects in new images of steel. Is that fair?
Exactly. But visual labeling is a huge pain, and particularly, I mean, maybe it's easier in the example that you mentioned, but for this astronomy data, we don't know the right answer. So we can label it. We can try and have people, citizen scientists label things, but it's there's just so much data, and that doesn't allow us to quantitatively really assess how well it's doing in the way the simulations do, which we don't have to hand label anything.
Yeah, no, but I think there's countless problems that people have images, they want to mark some, and experts could do it, but the real question, I guess, that I need to understand is you're not training anything in an it's not that you have 10,000 images and only 100 labels.
Yes.
You're not leveraging anything unsupervised here, right?
No, there's no unsupervised approach here.
Okay. That seems extremely useful and quite general. Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. Stella, do you want to read that and answer it?
If I can see it.
I can read it to you. Given that the training data is from hydrodynamics simulations, is there any concern that approximations in the simulations would cause accuracy issues that would be hard to detect at later stages?
Yeah, this is a question that I always get asked, which is basically, how similar is the observational and simulation data? And so before we embarked on this project, let me see if I can, yeah, so this is basically the question, right? And so you can imagine all kinds of cases where maybe the training set is not good enough, it's leaving out something, or the data is slightly different. So before we went through this whole process, we actually, I should try and skip some slides. We did a random forest approach. Yeah, so we did a random forest approach, which is just a classifier. So we did these synthetic observations, and we tested it directly against the citizen scientists. So places where you had humans already classify these images. Except we did, so you can do the training in a couple of ways, right? You could, for the random forest, you can just train it on what the people have identified, but you can also train it on the simulations only. So we tried various combinations of, training only on people, training only on simulations, training on hybrid approach. And the net result was that our random forest was able to really efficiently and accurately pick out these features. So this is a very different problem in the sense that the architecture is totally different. It's a different approach, but it gave us confidence that our underlying data was a good representation of the real data. That if our random forest can be trained only on simulations and still classify the real data efficiently, then that gives us a lot of confidence that there's good similarity between them.
Okay, so you have a question. For the 3D UNet, you need all the input volumes to be a certain size, right? Given that objects in space likely vary in size quite a bit, how do you make all the inputs to the UNet the same size?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we do is we have to break up the real observational data. The maps are huge. And so what we do is we break up the data into the appropriate size, which was what, 64, 64, 32 cubed. And then we scan around the entire observational data where there's good overlap between each of the inputs. And then one of the challenges we have is then reconstructing the identifications from these pieces of the images. And I think we're using average pooling to do that. Turns out max pooling was not
So
very
you're using standard kind of filter-based approach to
exactly.
do that.
Yeah.
One question I had for you is, what are, I mean, you kind of briefly alluded to this when you said that there was some issue with sort of the range of the data that you're looking at, and that makes life difficult. Maybe you could expand on that, but also, what are some of the, aside from like tweaking hyperparameters, what are some of the machine learning challenges that are holding you back right now?
Yeah, so the first issue with dynamic range is that you have, so the feedback, these bubbles are interacting with the surrounding material, but some of the voxels have a very, very low level of feedback in them. There's a very small fraction, but because there's a lot of emission or a lot of mass, when you multiply that by the total amount, it's a non-negligible fraction. So trying to make sure our architecture can identify things where the fraction is quite small is important. So that's what I mean by the dynamic range. And the second part is something that I would like is propagation of uncertainties in the network. So if we have some uncertainty in the inputs, can we propagate that and do a better job of estimating the uncertainties and the ultimate detections that we're getting? So that's another area that we'd like to work on.
I mean, you could try some simple sort of bootstrapping approaches to try and get an estimate for that.
Yeah.
We have another question. After you've identified regions of interest using the machine learning algorithm, what is the next step? Do you analyze particular regions further, or is it more to determine general properties / similarities between a large number of those regions?
Yeah, so the next step, once we have our pixel level map, is to do these larger physical post-processing to convert the result to mass, momentum, and energy. These are the questions that we want to get at. Sometimes we do statistics. Sort of a really nice thing that we have is once we have the pixel level identifications, we can do things like compute power spectra of them. And the power spectra can tell you, where the energy input is, the energy input scale, and how that, might change between looking at the entire cloud versus just the feedback. So we're trying to do both sort of, more classical approach of just adding up the net result, and also try to apply some statistical analysis on the maps, which is sort of unique to what we can do here because we have these pixel level detections.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, let's thank Stella again for the great talk. That was very interesting, and I'll be looking at these papers. It seems like a powerful technique.